The darkness of space stretched endlessly in every direction as the USS Valiant moved through the outer regions of the Kepler sector at standard patrol speed. Inside the ship, everything felt routine and calm like any other day in the deep void, where stars were just distant points of light and planets were weeks away from each other. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat at his communication station, running through the usual scans and checking frequencies for any unusual activity or messages that might need attention. His shift had been quiet for 6 hours straight, with nothing more interesting than background radiation and the occasional automated beacon from mining operations in nearby systems. The rest of the bridge crew seemed equally relaxed, with some officers quietly chatting about their plans for shore leave while others focused on their screens with the practiced ease of people who had done this job 1,000 times before. Captain Benjamin Hayes sat in his command chair near the center of the bridge, reviewing status reports on a datapad and occasionally glancing up at the main view screen that showed nothing but empty space and distant stars. He was a veteran officer with 15 years in deep space and had seen more than his share of strange situations. But lately everything had been predictable and peaceful, which was exactly what Fleet Command wanted. The Valiant was one of humanity's newest patrol cruisers, equipped with advanced sensors and weapon systems, designed to protect human colonies and trade routes from pirates or any other threats that might emerge in the frontier regions. So far, those threats had been minimal, and most days involved checking in with remote outposts or investigating asteroid fields for mineral deposits. Jake was about to start his routine report to the captain when his console suddenly lit up with an incoming signal that made his training kick in immediately. The frequency was completely unfamiliar and not part of any human communication network or known alien contact protocols. His fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface, isolating the transmission and running it through the ship's computer systems to analyze its origin and content. The signal was strong and appeared to be broadcasting on multiple frequencies at once, which suggested whoever sent it wanted to make sure someone would hear it. Jake felt his heartbeat increase as he realized what he might be looking at and quickly double-checked his readings to make sure this was not some kind of equipment malfunction or false alarm. "Captain Hayes, you need to hear this right now," Jake said, keeping his voice steady despite the excitement building inside him. The captain stood up immediately and walked over to the communication station, while the rest of the bridge crew turned their attention to what was happening. Hayes had learned to trust his officer's instincts, and the tone in Jake's voice told him this was something important. Jake played the transmission through the bridge speakers, and everyone fell completely silent as strange sounds filled the air. It was unlike anything in the Federation database, with a series of harmonic pulses mixed with what seemed like biological markers that rose and fell in patterns that suggested emotional content. The universal translator struggled to process the alien language, with error messages appearing on multiple screens. But even without translation, everyone on the bridge understood one thing clearly. This was a distress call. "How far away is the source?" Jake asked Captain Hayes, leaning closer to study the data streaming across the console. Lieutenant Lisa Chen at the navigation station immediately began running calculations and cross-referencing the signal's point of origin with their current position and known star charts. Point of origin is approximately 14 light-years away, bearing 273 Mark IV, she reported after a moment. "It's coming from an uncharted system that we have almost no data on except for basic stellar information." The message continued to repeat on a loop, and with each repetition it seemed to grow more desperate and urgent, as if whoever was sending it knew their time was running out. The translator kept working on the language, attempting to find patterns and similarities with other known forms of communication, but progress was slow. Captain Hayes stood silently for several seconds, listening to the alien voices and studying the data on the screens around him. His crew watched him carefully, knowing that whatever decision he made next would have serious consequences. Standard protocol required them to report any first contact situation to Fleet Command and wait for orders before proceeding, especially when dealing with unknown alien species in uncharted territory. But there was something about this transmission that went beyond protocols and regulations. These were living beings calling out into the darkness, hoping that someone somewhere would hear them and come to help. The emotional content of the message was undeniable even without understanding. The specific words in it spoke of fear and desperation that transcended language barriers. "Helm, plot a course. For that system, maximum warp speed. Hayes ordered with firm resolve in his voice. Communications send an encrypted message to Fleet Command immediately and let them know we are investigating a potential first contact scenario and responding to what appears to be a distress call. The bridge suddenly came alive with activity as officers moved to carry out their orders, while others began preparing the ship for high-speed travel and possible combat situations. Commander Greg Peterson, the first officer, stood up from his station with a concerned look on his face. Sir, regulations require we wait for backup before entering an unknown system, especially one that might involve hostile action, he said carefully. Those regulations were written by people sitting safely in offices back on Earth. Hayes replied without hesitation. Someone out there is dying right now, and we are the only ship close enough to help them in time, and I will not sit here and do nothing while people suffer. The Valiant's engines began powering up with a deep thrumming sound that resonated through the hull as the ship prepared to jump to faster than light speeds. In the crew quarters, word spread quickly through the ship's internal communication network that they were responding to an alien distress call and possibly heading into a first contact situation. Humanity had been reaching outward into space for over 200 years, building colonies and exploring distant star systems, always wondering if they were alone in the universe or if other intelligent life existed somewhere out there. Now it seemed they finally had their answer, and it was coming in the form of desperate voices calling for help across the void. Jake continued working on the transmission, trying to extract every piece of information he could from the repeating message. The universal translator slowly built up a database of linguistic patterns and began identifying what might be numbers or mathematical concepts that seemed universal across different forms of intelligence. He noticed something disturbing in the data stream that made his stomach tighten with worry. "Captain, I think they are including a countdown in this message," he said quietly. Hayes looked at the translation matrix on the screen where numbers were beginning to appear with increasing clarity. According to the computer's best analysis, the aliens had less than 7 hours before whatever was threatening them would reach some kind of critical point or completion. 7 hours to cross 14 light years and figure out what was happening and somehow help beings they had never met before. The Valiant jumped to warp speed, and the stars outside stretched into long lines of light as the ship accelerated beyond the normal limits of space and time. The Valiant dropped out of warp space at the edge of the unknown system, and what appeared on the main view screen made every person on the bridge freeze in place and stare in absolute horror. A planet roughly the size of Earth hung in the darkness, surrounded by a massive debris field that stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Hundreds of ships floated lifeless in orbit around the world with their hulls intact, but showing no signs of power or life support systems functioning. Some of the vessels were small, like personal transports, while others were larger cargo haulers or what might have been military patrol craft, but all of them were completely dead and drifting without control through the orbital space. Captain Hayes gripped the armrests of his command chair tightly as he took in the devastating scene before him. "Sensor readings, Lieutenant Chen," he ordered, and his voice was steady despite the shock everyone was feeling. Lisa's hands moved rapidly across her console, pulling up data streams and running analysis programs on everything the ship's sensors could detect in the system. "The planet is called Lorath, according to the identification beacons still broadcasting from the surface," she reported. "Class M environment with oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere and gravity point 98 times Earth standard. Captain, I am detecting over 2 billion life signs on the surface right now." The number hung in the air, like a weight pressing down on everyone, because 2 billion living beings meant this was not some small outpost or research station, but a fully inhabited world with cities and civilization and families. "What happened to those ships in orbit?" Hayes asked, pointing at the debris field on the screen. Lisa ran additional scans, focusing on the dead vessels and checking for radiation signatures or weapon impacts that might explain their condition. Some kind of electromagnetic pulse hit them hard enough to completely fry their system. "Miss," she explained. "They were not destroyed by conventional weapons, but disabled all at once, which means whatever did this has technology we have never seen before." The implications were clear and terrifying, because if someone could knock out hundreds of ships simultaneously, then humanity might be facing an enemy far more advanced than anything they had encountered. Jake's console suddenly lit up with new alerts, and his face went pale as he read the incoming data. "Captain, I am detecting 4 large vessels on an intercept course with the planet. and they are moving into attack position," he said urgently. The view screen shifted to show 4 enormous warships approaching Lorath from different angles, with their hulls made of some dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each ship was easily 10 times larger than the Valiant, and their design was angular and predatory, like something built specifically for hunting and killing. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as one of the approaching warships powered up a weapon system that glowed with red energy and then fired a brilliant beam directly at the planet's surface. Even from their position in high orbit, the Valiant's crew could see the impact point on the surface where the beam struck and created an explosion that vaporized everything within miles. A massive crater appeared glowing with residual heat and thermal radiation, while shockwaves spread outward, flattening structures and vegetation in a widening circle of destruction. "They are exterminating them," Commander Greg Peterson whispered, and his voice was filled with disbelief and horror. Before anyone could respond, another beam lanced down from a different warship, striking another population center on the opposite side of the planet and creating another zone of total devastation. Jake's communication console erupted with incoming transmissions as hundreds of voices from the planet's surface began broadcasting on every available frequency. The universal translator had finally gathered enough linguistic data to begin parsing the alien language, and suddenly the bridge speakers filled with voices speaking in desperate, broken phrases. "Please, anyone out there, help us. They came without warning 3 days ago. Our defense ships are all dead. We cannot fight back. Our children are dying. Please, someone answer." The translation was rough and imperfect, but the meaning was absolutely clear, and the emotion in those voices cut through every person. On the bridge, like a knife, Captain Hayes stood up from his chair, and his expression transformed into something cold and determined that his crew had rarely seen before. "Battle stations, all hands report to combat positions now," he ordered, and his voice carried throughout the ship via internal communications. "Weapons, bring all systems online and charge the main railguns. Shields to maximum power and route all available energy to defensive systems." The bridge exploded into controlled chaos as officers moved quickly to their stations and began preparing the Valiant for combat while down in engineering the reactor. Output increased to meet the sudden power demands. "Sir, we do not know anything about those enemy ships or their capabilities," Greg protested while pulling up tactical data on his screen. "We could be outgunned by factors we cannot even calculate, and if we engage them, we might not survive." Hayes looked at his first officer, and then at each member of his bridge crew one by one, meeting their eyes with absolute conviction. "I do not care if the odds are 1,000 to 1 against us," he said firmly. "We did not cross 14 light years just to watch genocide happen right in front of us while we do nothing. These people sent a distress call hoping someone would hear them, and we heard it, and that means we have a responsibility to act." The Valiant surged forward, accelerating toward the 4 massive warships that were systematically destroying the helpless planet below them. It was 1 human ship against 4 alien vessels, each vastly larger and possibly more powerful. But the crew did not hesitate because they understood what it meant to be human in that moment. It meant standing between the defenseless and those who would harm them, regardless of the personal cost or the overwhelming odds against success. Jake opened communication channels on all frequencies and broadcast a message toward the attacking warships using every language in the database, plus the newly translated Lorathi language. "Attention, unknown vessels, this is the United Earthship Valiant, operating under authority of the Earth Federation. You are engaged in an unprovoked attack on a civilian population, and we demand you cease fire immediately, or we will be forced to respond with military action." The response came within seconds as all 4 warships suddenly stopped firing at the planet and turned their weapons toward the approaching human vessel. Their targeting systems locked onto the Valiant, and multiple weapon arrays began charging with the same red energy they had used to devastate the surface. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster sat at the weapons station with his fingers hovering over the firing controls and a grim expression on his face. "Here we go," he said quietly. Captain Hayes watched the enemy ships growing larger on the view screen as the distance between them decreased rapidly, and he knew that in the next few minutes, everything would change for humanity, and for the people of Lorath, and possibly for the entire galaxy. The first beam lanced out from the nearest warship, cutting through space toward the Valiant, and the battle for Lorath began. The first enemy beam lanced toward the Valiant with terrifying speed, and Captain Hayes shouted for evasive maneuvers as the helmsman threw the ship into a hard roll to port. The energy blast skimmed past them so close that the shields flared bright blue and lit up the bridge with flickering light, while the ship shuddered from the near miss. Everyone grabbed their stations to steady themselves as the artificial gravity struggled to compensate for the violent movement, and Hayes felt his heart pounding, but kept his voice calm and controlled. Return fire immediately and target their forward. Weapon systems, he ordered, and Ryan Foster's fingers moved across the weapons console with practiced precision born from years of training and simulation exercises. The Valiant's railgun spoke with a deep thrumming sound that vibrated through the hull as magnetic accelerators launched tungsten projectiles at incredible velocity toward the nearest enemy warship. The rounds crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into the alien vessel's hull with devastating kinetic force that punched clean through their armor plating. Secondary explosions rippled across the warship's surface as internal systems were damaged, and atmosphere vented into space through the breaches. Direct hit, their forward weapons array is offline, Ryan reported with fierce satisfaction in his voice. But the celebration was short-lived because the other 3 warships were already responding to the threat, and multiple beams converged on the Valiant from different angles, making evasion nearly impossible. The ship's artificial intelligence took partial control of maneuvering and sent the cruiser into a complex series of rolls and directional changes that no human pilot could execute manually. 2 beams missed, but a third caught them along the starboard side, and the shields absorbed most of the energy, but not all of it. The bridge lights flickered and several consoles sparked as power fluctuations ran through the ship's systems. Shields down to 60%, reported Chief Engineer Nicole Brooks from her station near the back of the bridge. I am rerouting power from secondary systems to compensate, but we cannot take many more direct hits like that. Hayes nodded and studied the tactical display, showing the positions of all 4 enemy ships and their firing patterns while his mind worked rapidly to find any advantage they could exploit. Lisa Chen's console lit up with new data, and she looked up with surprise and hope on her face. Captain, I am picking up communications from the planet's surface, and they are cheering for us, she said. They know we are trying to help them, and word is spreading across the entire world. On the view screen, the damaged enemy warship was retreating slowly back toward a safer position, but the other 3 pressed their attack with renewed intensity, as if angered by the damage the humans had inflicted. Hayes watched their movements carefully and noticed something important about how they fought. They are moving in fixed formations like they have never faced real opposition before, he observed. Greg looked at the patterns and understood immediately what the captain meant. Use that, Captain Hayes ordered. Jake, transmit all our tactical data to the planet's surface and see if any of their people can get even one ship or defense platform operational. Lisa, plot us a course through that debris field at maximum combat speed. The navigator's eyes widened, because navigating through a debris field filled with dead ships and wreckage at high speed was incredibly dangerous, but she understood the strategy and began calculating the course. Sir, navigating debris at combat velocity is extremely risky, she warned. But Hayes cut her off. It is exactly what humans do best, so execute the order now. The Valiant dove into the graveyard of disabled Lorathi ships, weaving between hulls and debris with precision that seemed almost reckless. The enemy warships followed but were forced to slow down significantly because their massive hulls could not maneuver through the tight spaces with the same agility as the smaller human cruiser. Ryan used this advantage perfectly by firing quick bursts from behind cover before the Valiant darted to a new position among the Dubuar Ekage. One enemy beam struck a dead Lorathi cargo ship that exploded in a shower of metal fragments that damaged another enemy vessel's shields. The aliens were growing frustrated, and their formation began to break apart as each ship tried to get a clear shot at the elusive human cruiser that kept disappearing behind obstacles. On the planet's surface, the Lorathi people watched through telescopes and sensor arrays as the impossible happened before their eyes. For 3 days, the dark ships had hunted them, systematically destroying their defenses and burning their cities, while their military was helpless with all vessels disabled by the initial electromagnetic pulse. They had sent their desperate message into the void, never truly believing anyone would answer, because the galaxy had always seemed empty and silent. But the humans had come, and one small ship was fighting 4 giants with a ferocity and courage that seemed beyond reason. In shelters deep underground, families huddled together listening to updates, and many began to cry with relief and hope they had thought was lost forever. Jake's console chimed with an incoming transmission and his face lit up with excitement. Captain, I am receiving a message from someone on the surface named Kalesh, who says he has managed to restore power to one of their old orbital defense platforms. Hayes immediately asked for coordinates, and Jake began transmitting detailed targeting information to the Lorathi engineer, along with instructions on how to coordinate their attack. On the platform, Kalesh was a young technician who had spent the last day crawling through damaged systems trying to bypass the electromagnetic pulse effects that had crippled everything. When he finally got power restored and saw the instructions appearing on his screen from the human ship, he could barely believe what they were asking him to. "Do trust us," the message said in his own language, translated by the human computer. "Fire when we mark the target and we will do the rest." The Valiant suddenly broke from cover in the debris field and accelerated directly toward the 3 pursuing warships, as if charging to certain death. Ryan's hands moved steadily across his console as he counted down silently, while the enemy ships locked all weapons on the approaching human vessel. At the last possible second before the aliens could fire, the Valiant rolled and dove while Ryan painted the centermost enemy warship with a targeting laser that lit up every sensor on Kalesh's defense platform. "Now," Captain Hayes shouted, and Kalesh pressed the firing button with shaking hands. The defense platform's plasma cannon was old technology designed decades ago when the Lorathi still feared conflict might come to their peaceful world. The weapon had been forgotten during long years of peace, but now it roared to life, sending a massive bolt of superheated plasma across the distance to strike the marked warship directly in its engine section. The explosion was catastrophic, as the enemy vessel's power core lost containment and detonated in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire orbital space. Debris from the destroyed ship scattered in all directions and damaged the shields of the 2 remaining warships. On the bridge of the Valiant, the crew erupted in cheers while Kalesh sat stunned at his station, unable to believe he had just destroyed one of the terrible dark ships. 2 enemy warships remained, and for the first time since they had arrived at Lorath, they hesitated in their attack, as if suddenly uncertain about the outcome of this battle. Hayes saw that hesitation and knew it meant they had a real chance to win. "All weapons fire at will," he ordered, and the Valiant came around for another attack run while, down on the planet, millions of Lorathi people watched and hoped and prayed to their gods that the humans would prevail. Word of the human ship's courage spread across Lorath like wildfire through dry grass and in shelters deep beneath the scorched surface. Families huddled around communication devices, listening to real-time updates from observers who watched the battle through telescopes and sensors. The impossible was happening right above their world, as the exterminators who had come to wipe them out were now being hunted and destroyed by a single alien vessel that fought with a determination that seemed beyond understanding. Children asked their parents who these humans were and why they had come to help strangers they had never met, and the parents had no answers except to say that perhaps the universe was not as cold and empty as they had feared. On the Valiant's bridge, exhaustion was beginning to set in after nearly an hour of constant combat, but adrenaline kept everyone moving and thinking clearly. The 2 remaining enemy warships had changed their tactics and were now staying close together to cover each other's weak points, while still firing at the planet whenever they got a clear shot. "Shields are down to 30%, Nicole reported, and her voice was strained with fatigue. "I am pulling power from life support in unoccupied sections and routing everything to defensive systems. But we are running on fumes here, Captain." Hayes nodded and studied the tactical display showing the enemy ships maintaining a defensive formation that made them harder to attack. Individually, the enemy vessels were learning from their mistakes and no longer chasing the Valiant into the debris field or separating from each other. They had positioned themselves so their shields overlapped, creating a stronger defensive barrier, while their weapons could still target both the human ship and the planet below. It was a smart tactical decision that showed they were not just mindless killers, but trained military forces with experience and discipline. Hayes needed to find a way to break that formation and force them into a vulnerable position, but conventional attacks were not working anymore. "Jake, can we overload one of our torpedoes with antimatter and turn it into a massive bomb?" he asked suddenly. Jake's eyes widened as he understood what the captain was suggesting, and he quickly ran calculations on his console. "Theoretically, yes, but the yield would be enormous," Jake replied. "If we detonate it between those 2 ships, the blast wave would hit both of them simultaneously and probably overload their shields. The problem is we would need to get close enough to deliver it, and they will see us coming from far away. Hayes smiled grimly because he had already thought of a solution to that problem. Unless they are looking somewhere else, he said. Jake, open a channel to Kalesh on that defense platform, and tell him we need every ship, satellite, and platform that can still broadcast to light up and make it look like they are powering weapons. It will be a bluff, but their sensors will not know that. Immediately, minutes later, every functional piece of Lorathi technology in orbit began emitting power signatures that looked like weapons charging or shields activating. It was all fake because none of them could actually fire, but the sensors on the enemy warships could not tell the difference without detailed scans. The two alien vessels split their attention trying to track dozens of potential threats appearing all around them in orbit, and their weapon systems moved frantically trying to cover every angle. In that moment of confusion and distraction, the Valiant accelerated to maximum attack speed and arrowed straight toward the narrow gap between the two enemy ships like a missile, seeking its target. Torpedo away, Ryan called out as he launched the modified weapon with its overloaded antimatter warhead that glowed with barely contained energy. The projectile streaked through space on a direct course for the point exactly between the two warships, and the enemy ships detected it almost immediately. Their defensive beams lashed out trying to destroy the incoming torpedo before it could reach them. But Ryan had programmed an erratic, unpredictable flight path that made targeting extremely difficult. The torpedo jinked and weaved through the defensive fire and closed the distance while precious seconds ticked away. The antimatter warhead detonated between the two warships, and for a brief moment it seemed like a new sun had been born in orbit around Lorath. The explosion was absolutely catastrophic, with temperatures reaching millions of degrees and a blast wave that expanded outward at tremendous speed, carrying enough force to shatter mountains. Both enemy vessels were caught directly in the fury of the detonation, and their shields overloaded instantly, sending feedback surges through their systems. The armor plating on both ships began to vaporize under the intense heat and radiation, while internal explosions tore through decks and compartments. One ship was torn completely in half, with both sections tumbling away, trailing debris and frozen atmosphere, while the other survived but was crippled, beyond any ability to fight, with massive hull breaches and all weapons offline. On the Valiant, the crew erupted in cheers and shouts of victory as they watched the enemy ships break apart on their screens. Captain Hayes allowed himself a moment of relief and let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. Jake, open a channel to the planet and tell them the immediate threat has been neutralized, he ordered. The response from Lorath was immediate and overwhelming as every frequency flooded with messages of gratitude, disbelief, and pure joy. Kalish's voice came through the speakers, translated by the ship's computer, and he was crying as he spoke. You actually came for us. We thought no one would ever hear our call, but you came." Hayes felt emotion tighten his throat, and he replied simply, "Someone always hears, and we are just glad we got here in time." Lisa was already running detailed scans of the crippled enemy warship that was still intact, but drifting helplessly with its engines dead and life support failing. "Captain, I am detecting life signs aboard that vessel, and their oxygen levels are dropping fast," she reported. Greg turned to look at Hayes with surprise on his face. "You are not seriously thinking of rescuing them after what they tried to do," he said. Hayes met his first officer's eyes with calm certainty. "We are going to conduct rescue operations because even if they are our enemies, we do not let people suffocate in space, because that is not who we are, and not what humanity stands for." The bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed those words and understood that their captain was right, as the Valiant moved to begin rescue operations. For both the surviving Lorathi and their former attackers, a new alert sounded from the sensor station. "Multiple warp signatures approaching fast," Lisa announced. Jake quickly identified the incoming vessels, and relief flooded through him. "It is the Fifth Fleet transmitting proper identification codes, and it looks like at least 20 ships. The cavalry has finally arrived." But everyone on the bridge knew the real truth that would never be spoken aloud in official reports. The cavalry had not saved Lorath from destruction and genocide. One ship had done that. One crew who heard a distress call from strangers across 14 light years of empty space and decided that distance meant nothing when someone needed help. The massive vessels of Earth's Fifth Fleet began dropping out of warp around Lorath, and their commanders were stunned by what their sensors showed them. A battlefield filled with destroyed alien warships, a battered human cruiser conducting rescue operations, and a planet full of grateful aliens who were broadcasting messages of thanks on every available frequency. Admiral Helen Morrison sat in her command chair aboard the flagship and watched the scene with a mixture of pride and concern. She ordered her communications officer to get her a direct line to Captain Hayes immediately because she needed to understand exactly what had happened here and why one patrol cruiser had engaged 4 unknown alien warships without waiting for backup or authorization. The answers to those questions would have consequences that reached far beyond this single star system and would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. The aftermath of the battle was complex and filled with questions that nobody had easy answers. For as the Fifth Fleet arrived to find a situation that defied every standard, protocol, and regulation in Earth's military handbook, the Kresh prisoners recovered from the crippled warship were hostile at first, but eventually began talking under interrogation, and what they revealed sent shockwaves through the human command structure. The Kresh hierarchy was an old civilization that had been purging emerging spacefaring species from their territory for over 3 centuries, and they saw it as simple pest control to eliminate any potential rivals before they could become threats. The Lorathi were just the latest victims in a long list of extinct civilizations that had made the mistake of sending radio signals into space and revealing their existence. Admiral Helen Morrison stood in her ready room aboard the flagship looking out at the damaged Valiant in the repair dock with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Captain Hayes stood at attention before her desk, still wearing his battle-worn uniform that showed scorch marks and damage from the fighting. "Your actions may have started a war with the Kresh hierarchy, Captain," she said quietly. "They are not going to accept the loss of 4 warships without demanding some kind of response or retaliation." Hayes met her eyes without flinching and replied with firm conviction. "Then they should not have been committing genocide against innocent people who did nothing except exist in the wrong part of space." A long silence stretched between them as the Admiral considered his words and the implications of everything that had happened. "For what it is worth, you did the right thing," Helen finally said, and a slight smile crossed her stern face. "The politicians back on Earth are going to have headaches for months trying to figure out the diplomatic mess. But you saved 2 billion lives, and that counts for more than any regulation or protocol." Hayes felt relief wash through him because he had known there would be consequences for his decision, but he had never regretted it for a single moment. The Lorathi people deserved to live, and if humanity could not stand up for that principle, then what was the point of reaching for the stars in the first place? Helen dismissed him, and Hayes left the ready room feeling exhausted but satisfied that he had done his duty not to fleet command but to something larger and more important. On Lorath's surface, first contact was proceeding better than anyone had hoped or expected, despite the terrible circumstances that had brought the 2 species together. The Lorathi were a gentle people whose entire civilization was built around concepts of art and philosophy and collective harmony that valued cooperation over competition. They had ventured into space with hopes of finding friends among the stars and sharing their culture with others, but instead they had found the Kresh, who saw them as nothing more than insects to be exterminated. Now they had found humans, and they were struggling to understand these strange aliens who fought with such ferocity but also showed such compassion. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood in what remained of Lorath's capital city, surrounded by curious aliens who were tall and willowy with iridescent skin that shifted colors based on their emotions. Currently, most of them were glowing a warm golden color that the translator identified as gratitude and joy, mixed with lingering fear. Kalesh approached him with several other Lorathi who had helped during the battle, and they bowed deeply in a gesture of respect that Jake awkwardly tried to return. "We have never seen anyone fight like your people," Kalesh said through the translation device. "So much courage and strength, and you were not even afraid to die for strangers." Jake thought about how to explain something fundamental about humanity and finally said, "We have a saying that is crude but captures something essential about us, and it goes like this. Humanity does not give up, and we do not leave people behind when they need help. Will you teach us to fight like you?" Kalesh asked with earnest hope in his voice. "To be strong like you so we can defend ourselves if the Kresh come back." Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "We will teach you to defend yourselves and how to build better weapons and shields. But real strength is not just about fighting or killing. Real strength is knowing what is worth fighting for, and you already have that. The Lorathi seemed to understand, and their skin colors shifted to deeper shades that indicated thoughtful consideration of his words. Around them, the work of rebuilding was already beginning as Lorathi civilians emerged from shelters and started clearing rubble, while human engineers helped restore power systems and communication networks in orbit above the planet. Diplomatic teams from Earth were working frantically to establish formal relations with the Lorathi government and create the framework for an alliance that would protect them from future Kresh attacks. The Lorathi offered everything they had, including technology resources and even territory, as payment for being saved, but Earth's diplomats politely declined most of it. Instead, they proposed a mutual defense pact and cultural exchange program that would benefit both species equally. Within days, the basic structure of humanity's first true alliance with an alien civilization was being drafted, and lawyers on both sides worked to translate complex concepts across the language barrier. The Kresh hierarchy, meanwhile, faced a serious problem that their leadership had never encountered before in 300 years of purging operations. Their council chambers on the Kresh homeworld erupted in heated debates as military leaders and politicians argued about how to respond to this unprecedented defeat. Some called for immediate retaliation and demanded that a full battle fleet be sent to destroy both the humans and the Lorathi. Others urged caution and pointed out that they knew almost nothing about human military capabilities, except that one ship had destroyed 4 of their best warships. A few voices even suggested negotiation, which was an almost unthinkable concept for a civilization that had never needed to negotiate with prey species before. While the Kresh debated and argued, the humans prepared for whatever might come next. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking at strategic maps that showed the entire sector and the locations of known Kresh territory. The Kresh hierarchy controlled a significant portion of this region of space, and their purge fleets wiped out countless civilizations over the centuries, leaving nothing but dead worlds and silence. But that was going to change because humanity had drawn a line in the void and said no further. She turned to her tactical officer and asked what their current force readiness was. "We have 37 ships in this sector right now, and more are being diverted from other patrol routes," Admiral, the officer reported. "Fleet Command is also accelerating construction on new vessels, and we should have significant reinforcements within 6 months. Send a priority message to all fleet vessels in this sector," Morrison ordered. "Any distress call from any species is to be treated as a priority. One emergency requiring immediate response regardless of distance or danger. The Kresh learned today that humanity does not ignore cries for help, and I want to make sure that message is heard across this entire region of space." Her crew moved to carry out the orders while Morrison continued studying the maps and thinking about the future. Humanity had been alone in the universe for so long, always wondering if anyone else was out there, and now they knew the truth. The galaxy was full of life, but it was also full of predators who saw emerging civilizations as threats to be eliminated. Back on the Valiant, Captain Hayes sat in his quarters looking at a video message from his daughter Katie, who was back on Earth. "Dad, everyone is talking about you and calling you a hero," she said with excitement in her voice. "You saved an entire planet and fought against impossible odds." Hayes smiled tiredly and recorded his response. "I was just doing my job, sweetie. And anyone would have done the same thing. Someone called for help and we helped them because that is what humans do." He sent the message and leaned back in his chair thinking about everything that had happened. The story of the Valiant was already spreading through human space faster than any official report could travel, and other species were hearing it too through trade networks and communication channels. The reputation of humanity was being shaped by this single event, and the message was clear to everyone who heard it. Humans were the newcomers and the young species who had barely left their own solar system, but they had proven something important about themselves. They heard every distress call and they always answered, no matter the cost or the danger. In the dark reaches of space, other civilizations in trouble began sending their own messages, hoping that maybe this time someone would hear them and come to help. The Kresh had learned a painful lesson that would reshape the political structure of the entire galactic sector, and that lesson was simple. Humanity had arrived among the stars, and they were not going to let innocent people suffer while they stood by and watched.